So voting is one of our most essential rights. And one way to measure our nation's progress over 250 years is to track the expansion of access to the polls. Mostly the arc of voting justice has bent towards more access. Donald Trump is correct, and you won't hear me say those words often, when he says that he won more votes than any previous presidential candidate. Only Joe Biden got even more votes than Donald Trump, of course. You could look at all of this as an extraordinary and welcome expansion of voting. More people voted in the 2020 election than ever before in our country's history. But instead of celebrating this, the Republican Party, Trump and his fan base, and QAnon are aligned in a push to take us backwards. Fired up by Trump's pure fantasy and the presidential election, was stolen from him and enabled by the QAnon conspiracy machine.
The reality here, Guy, as you know very well, is that we have restrictive voting laws in several states throughout this country. Early voting in Arizona, a Republican state, might I remind you, has been in effect for over a decade. It is overseen by an independent commission. This is something that works. Republicans, Democrats, independents, they use early voting. It only became convenient when Donald Trump wanted to challenge the election because he had his own issues. So, I understand the Republican Party is in a little bit of an existential crisis. They don't know whether or not to go with the conspiracy QAnon people in the Trump world or go with the logic-based people. So they have to figure out where to go. But the reality is,
there is a lot to unpack there.
So Republicans have mounted what veteran political writer Ron Brownstein described as the greatest assault on the right to vote since Jim Crow. For years, Republicans have been trying to suppress voting with phony claims of fraud. They would scream fraud and then enact measures to prevent the fraud that they made up. Measures like ID requirements, whose real effect was to, of course, deter Black and brown voters. This has been ugly. But as Biden's victory demonstrated, in the big picture, it hasn't worked. Certainly, it hasn't worked as well as Republicans wanted it to. So if your lie isn't working, what do? Oh, you tell an even bigger lie, of course. Now, it isn't just fraud by individual voters or even groups. It is a massive conspiracy now to steal the 2020 election. If you really believe that happened, then the logical thing to do is make sure it never happens again, right? Except, of course, it didn't happen. And the real goal is to suppress voting. This is a modern day version of burning crosses by the polling places. This is intimidation by legislation. 250 bills in 43 states. It's the number of bills introduced in state houses this last year to suppress voting. It hasn't just doubled or tripled. According to the Brennan Center, proposals to restrict voting have increased 7 times this year. We need to push back against his ugly movement, Donald Trump's ugly movement, and push back hard. H.R. 1 is part of that. It is a bill of voting rights that could help slow the Republican drive. But 2 things must be said. First, while the passage of H.R. 1 in the House is never in doubt, its future in the Senate is, of course, uncertain. And you've heard this here before. We don't know if Democrat Joe Manchin will support voting rights. So this is where Joe Biden has to, stand up. We need his leadership. We need all 50 senators and Vice President Kamala Harris to understand the urgency of this. Either we protect voting rights now, or we pay the price for a generation or 2. It is not complicated. But the other point is that even with H.R. 1, there are ballots to be fought state by state. Arizona Republicans are trying to restrict mail-in voting, even though they've supported it for years, as I said. In Georgia, Republicans are pushing new rules to require an ID to get your absentee ballot and other measures that would restrict the manner in which more than 2 million Georgians voted in 2020. We can't afford to leave this fight all to a piece of federal legislation, as valuable as that would be. Wherever you live, find out what's happening on voter suppression legislation in your state and join the fight to protect voting rights. You got to use it or lose it. This is super important. All right, we have an extraordinary show today. Simon Rode and Jordan Zakarin are back. And in a moment, we have a special conversation with Shannon Foley Martinez. She's a former white supremacist who broke free and now is an advocate for creating community resources against violence. And then just after that, we talked to Puerto Rican activists to discuss the status of Puerto Rico with David Galarza. He's a friend. He's great. You don't want to miss it. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.